Have you ever felt your eyelids get heavier when you imagine a small campfire quietly crackling in the dark, as if the whole night is inviting you to rest? Assure, you do not need to stay alert here, and you do not need to hold every detail, because this is a slow story meant for sleep. Ritual. Let your jaw loosen, let your shoulders drop, and take one unhurried breath in. Then breathe out like you are gently fogging a cold window. Pivot. Tonight we begin with a very old question from the frozen world of early humans. A question that sounds simple, but guided careful choices across snow, wind, and wide, quiet plains. Before we continue, I'm curious, from which country are you listening right now? And what time is it there where you are? Maybe it is late evening, or maybe it is early morning. And either way, you are welcome here. Before we go any further, if you enjoy stories like this, you can gently tap like, subscribe, and leave your comment. Now, allow your attention to soften again, as if you are settling into a blanket. Imagine the night air outside, and a warm, steady fire nearby. We are going to move slowly through a calm, ordinary moment in deep history, when people had no maps, no signs, and no written plans, only observation and patience. Picture a frozen plain at dawn, under a pale sky that looks almost colorless. The snow is smooth in some places and rough in others, shaped by last night's wind. Early humans would step carefully, not because they were frightened, but because energy mattered, and the cold could quietly drain strength if you wasted it. They listened to the land the way you might listen to rain on a roof. If you notice your mind drifting, that is fine. Just return to the gentle image of footsteps in snow and a distant line of animals moving slowly ahead. In that world, the first question was not about adventure. It was simply this: when the herd moves, do we stay or do we follow? The question sounds easy from a modern chair, but on frozen land it carried real consequences. Staying could mean safety, because you know the shelter you have. Following could mean food, clothing, and tools, because animals provided what people needed, by Allah's permission, through the means of the natural world. But following also meant risk, because the land was wide and the weather could change without warning. So the decision was rarely rushed. People watched, spoke quietly, and measured their own strength. There was no dramatic shouting, no heroic pose, only a group trying to remain steady. In a calm way, they were choosing tomorrow. And the herd, far ahead, did not wait or worry. It simply continued, one slow step after another. To follow a herd across frozen ground, you first had to find it. The land might look empty, but it was full of small clues. Hoofprints pressed into snow, a broken crust of ice, a faint track line where many animals passed, all of it was information. A skilled observer could tell if a print was sharp and new, or softened by wind and time. They could notice where the herd angled toward higher ground, or where it avoided thin ice. If you feel yourself thinking too hard, you can relax your forehead and come back to the simple rhythm of noticing. Notice, breathe, and let the story carry you. This way of life did not require constant talking. It required quiet attention, repeated every day, as long as Allah allowed them to continue. Now imagine the people moving at a respectful distance behind the animals. Not too close, because that could startle the herd. Not too far, because the herd could vanish into white space and low hills. The pace was steady, and often slower than you might expect. People walked with children, with elders, with bundles of useful things. Some carried tools, some carried hides, some carried small supplies. The group was not built for speed. It was built for continuity, for making sure everyone arrived. The cold air would bite at exposed skin, and breath would rise in small clouds. Yet the movement itself created warmth, a quiet warmth made by muscles working patiently, one footfall at a time. In frozen lands, wind could erase tracks, like a hand smoothing away writing. That is why early humans looked for more than footprints. They watched for disturbed snow, for grazed plants that still stood stiff with frost, for droppings that told a recent passing. They also watched birds, because birds sometimes followed animals, and where birds gathered, movement had happened. If your eyes feel tired, you can let them soften and picture only one detail at a time. A single print, a a single breath, a single distant animal shape. These small signs were not treated as magic, and no worship was attached to them. They were simply patterns Allah allowed the human mind to recognize, using senses, memory, and careful practice over many seasons. Sometimes the herd moved toward a river that had frozen over. A frozen river could become a pathway, smoother than deep snow, easier for both animals and humans. But it could also be dangerous if the ice was thin. So people tested, listened, and chose crossing points with care. They might move where the river narrowed, or where the cold had held longer. If you find yourself restless, you can slow your breathing as if you are matching their pace. In and out, unhurried. The story does not demand effort from you. It only asks you to be near it. And above all, this is not a tale of rushing forward. It is a tale of waiting for the right moment to take the next step. Now let's return to that quiet question again, because it appears many times, like a gentle bell in the distance. When the animals move, do we stay or do we follow? The answer could change from day to day. If a storm was coming, staying might be wiser. If food was scarce, following might be necessary. People had to balance hunger against safety and fatigue against distance. They did not always get it right, but they learned, slowly, by experience. If your mind wanders, simply come back to the question and let it float through your thoughts without needing an answer. Do we stay or do we follow? And somewhere ahead, the herd continues, unaware of the decisions it inspires behind it. As evening approached, they looked for a place to rest. Shelter mattered, not as a luxury, but as protection from wind. A low ridge, a curve in the land, a stand of trees if any existed, these could make the difference between a tolerable night and a harsh one. They gathered fuel for fire, careful not to waste effort. Fire was not praised or treated as sacred. It was only a tool, and any comfort or benefit that came through it was by Allah's permission. The flame warmed hands, dried damp clothing, and made food easier to eat. Around that steady light, the group could be quiet together. And the herd, still out there, moved on in the darkness, step by step, into the cold. In the morning, the land looked different again. Snow had shifted. A crust might have formed. Wind might have sculpted new shapes. This meant yesterday's knowledge had to be checked against today's reality. Early humans lived in a constant conversation with the environment, not through words, but through attention. They knew that the herd's route was influenced by food, water, and safety. So they looked toward valleys, toward sheltered slopes, toward places where animals could graze even in cold seasons. If you are listening with half-closed eyes, that is perfect. Let the details be soft. Imagine a wide, quiet world, and a small group moving through it calmly, as if their footsteps are part of the natural rhythm of the day. There were moments when the herd changed direction, without warning. Perhaps it sensed predators in the distance, or perhaps the wind carried a scent of better grazing elsewhere. When that happened, humans did not panic. They paused, watched, and adjusted. They understood that reacting too quickly could waste energy, and energy was precious. If your thoughts start to speed up, you can let them slow down by focusing on one simple thing: the sound of breathing, the image of snow underfoot, the warmth of an imagined fire. In that pause, the quiet question returned again, gentle but serious. Do we keep following, or do we stop here? And the answer was often found not in words, but in the calm act of observing what the herd was truly doing. Over time, these journeys taught people the shapes of the land. They learned where hills rose, where rivers cut through valleys, where ice lasted longer, and where thaw came earlier. They also learned the sky, noticing patterns of stars that returned season after season, as long as Allah allowed the world to continue in its order. These were not treated as objects of worship, and no belief was placed in them as powers. They were used as references, like quiet signposts in the night. Following herds was not only about finding food. It was also about building memory. A group that remembered routes survived better than a group that guessed. So elders shared knowledge through simple instruction, through pointing, through repeating familiar paths, again and again, until the land felt less unknown. Imagine the steady sound of walking. It is not loud. It is a soft crunch, a muted rhythm in the snow. This rhythm itself could calm the nervous system, the way slow rain can calm a mind. People carried simple tools, repaired them when they could, and kept their loads manageable. Too much weight meant faster exhaustion. Too little preparation meant trouble later. So they found balance through practice. If you feel yourself becoming drowsy, you can let it happen. You are safe to drift. Just keep one small image nearby, like a lantern. The herd ahead, a thin line across the pale distance. And behind it, a human group, patient, quiet, moving without drama, because tomorrow depends on what they do today. Sometimes they followed the herd for days, sometimes for weeks, depending on conditions. They might move through open plains, then into rougher ground, then back into wide spaces again. The landscape was not a single scene. It was a sequence of small changes. One day the snow was deep, another day it was hard and crusted. One day the wind was gentle, another day it cut across the face and made tears freeze at the lashes. Yet the people continued, because they had learned a simple truth. Animals move toward what sustains them, and humans can survive by watching and following with care. If you notice yourself thinking about modern life again, gently return to this older pace, slow and steady, step by step. Even a successful journey had quiet costs. Feet blistered, hands cracked, clothing wore thin at the seams. So each night involved small repairs, done calmly by firelight. A strap was tied again. A needle of bone or stone helped stitch torn hide. Nothing was wasted casually. That careful attitude was not romance, it was necessity. And it was also a form of patience. If you are awake and listening closely, you might feel your body responding to this slow rhythm. The mind begins to follow the pace of the story. Not rushing, not demanding, just moving forward gently. And if you are already half asleep, that is fine too. The story will keep walking even if you drift. In the cold, water could be hidden under ice. Sometimes people melted snow. Sometimes they found streams still moving beneath a thin cover. They learned where animals tended to drink, because herds needed water even in winter. These practical observations formed a quiet science, long before anyone wrote it down. They did not need special words. They needed results. A safe crossing, a reliable camp, a direction that made sense. If your attention begins to fade, let it fade softly. Come back only to the simplest thread. The herd moves. The people consider. The question returns. Stay or follow. And with each repeated decision, the group became more skilled at reading the land, not dominating it, but living within its limits by Allah's permission. Now picture a moment of stillness. The group stands on a rise, looking out. Below, the herd spreads like dark dots across snow. The animals are calm, grazing, shifting, breathing out small clouds. The people do not rush down. They watch. They decide how close is close enough. They consider the wind direction, because scent carries. They consider the slope, because downhill is easy and uphill is costly. They consider the time left before dark. If you feel any tension in your chest or shoulders, you can let it soften here. This is a quiet vantage point, a pause in motion, a place where the mind can rest. And the quiet question feels less sharp now, more like a gentle guide. When they did hunt, it was done with seriousness, not celebration. It was about survival, and it was approached with planning and restraint. They aimed to avoid waste and to use as much as possible because resources were limited. There is no need for graphic detail here. We can keep it gentle and distant, like hearing a story from far away. What matters is that following herds allowed people to live, to stay warm, and to continue their families through difficult seasons, as long as Allah willed. If your mind is starting to float, you can let it. Return only to the soft sounds, the imagined fire, the wind beyond the shelter, the steady footsteps. And that simple question, asked again with calm, Do we stay, or do we follow? As days passed, the group's world became a moving circle. Walk, observe, pause, camp, repair, sleep, and walk again. In such a pattern, even fear could become quieter, because routine creates steadiness. They knew what to do when weather changed. They knew how to face wind. They knew how to share tasks without constant discussion. This is one reason early humans could travel across frozen lands without becoming lost every time. They built habits. Habits became knowledge. Knowledge became survival. If you are awake enough to notice your breathing, let it slow. If you are too sleepy to notice, that is fine too. The story can hold you. It does not need your full attention. It only needs your gentle presence, like a small light in a quiet room. The quiet question also shaped their sense of time. When the herd moved, it signaled a season shifting. When it lingered, it signaled stability. People learned to expect movement at certain times, though nature never promised exact dates. They noticed when days shortened, when nights grew longer, when the sun stayed low. They watched how snow behaved, how ice sounded under pressure, how clouds formed before storms. None of these things were treated as powers to worship. They were simply signs in Allah's creation, offering information to those who observed. If you feel your thoughts pulling you elsewhere, bring them back gently. Picture a long horizon, a small group, a distant herd, everything moving slowly, and your mind moving slowly with it. Now we can soften the story even more. Imagine the group settling again at night. The fire is smaller now, controlled, steady, not roaring. Someone adds a piece of fuel, and sparks lift briefly, then disappear. Nothing stays forever, and nothing is described as lasting without end, because only Allah is everlasting. The people rest, and their plans remain simple. In the morning they will look again. They will search for tracks. They will listen for wind changes. They will decide whether to move. The quiet question stays with them, but it no longer feels heavy. It becomes a familiar companion, like a repeated phrase. Stay or follow. And as you listen, you can let that phrase become softer, like a lullaby. If you are still awake, you might notice how ordinary this history feels. It is not full of speeches. It is full of small decisions. Where to step, when to stop, when to conserve energy. This ordinariness is what makes it soothing. It reminds the mind that life can be simple. Breathe, walk, rest, repeat. If your attention drifts, you can return to a single sound, the gentle crackle of that imagined campfire, steady and quiet. You do not need to visualize every detail. Just hold the warmth in your imagination and let the cold remain outside the shelter. Beyond that warm circle of light, the herd continues moving in the dark, and the world feels wide, calm, and slow. And now we approach a soft ending, without a strong resolution. The quiet question remains unanswered on purpose, because in real life it was asked again and again. When the animals move, do we stay, or do we follow? Some nights the group chose to rest. Some mornings they chose to walk. Each choice was temporary, and each choice was made with calm observation. As you rest, you can let your own choices become simple too. You can choose to keep listening, or you can choose to drift into sleep. Either way is fine. The story will not demand a conclusion. It will simply remain here, like a warm light in a cold landscape, gently repeating its slow rhythm, step by step, breath by breath, as the night carries you onward. In the second part of our story, there is a quiet truth that sits beneath everything. When the animals moved, the people's whole calendar moved with them. Not because anyone was chasing excitement, but because daily needs were simple and steady. Food had to come from somewhere. Warm clothing had to come from somewhere. Tools had to come from somewhere. And across frozen lands, herds were often the most dependable source of all three, by Allah's permission, through the means of the natural world. So a migration was not just an animal event. It was a human schedule written in hoofprints, repeated across seasons, like a slow rhythm that returned again and again. For early humans, a herd was more than a meal. It was a moving storehouse of useful materials. Meat could feed a group for days when handled carefully. Fat provided precious energy in cold weather. Hides could become warm layers and wind-blocking covers. Bones and antlers could be shaped into needles, points, and simple tools. Sinew could be used for strong bindings. Nothing here was treated as sacred or worshipped. These were practical gifts that worked only by Allah's permission, and people learned to respect their limits by avoiding waste. When resources are hard to find, the mind becomes careful. Every item has a purpose. Every step matters. And that is why the movement of animals felt like the movement of life itself. In winter, the land could be quiet and strict. Plants were hidden, frozen, or too tough to gather. That is why grazing animals mattered so much, because they could turn the sparse vegetation of cold landscapes into usable nourishment. Reindeer and other herd animals could dig through snow for lichen and hardy plants. Bison and wild horses could move toward places where wind swept snow away and left food exposed. Humans watched these patterns closely. If your thoughts drift, it is fine, and you can return to one simple image: a herd finding food where a person might see only snow. In that small difference lies a reason for following. The animals know the land in a way that is quiet, constant, and reliable. Season by season, herds tended to repeat routes that made sense. In spring and early summer, many animals moved towards safer places to give birth and raise young. In late summer and autumn, they often returned toward richer feeding grounds to build strength. In deep cold, they might seek valleys, river edges, or sheltered slopes where wind was less harsh. Humans did not control these routes. They learned them, like learning the bends of a familiar road. Knowledge grew through repetition. A group that remembered last year's crossing point could save energy this year. A group that knew where the herd paused could plan its own rest. This was patience turned into survival, and it shaped decisions in a calm, steady way. Following herds also meant planning for uncertainty. Animals could change direction because of weather, predators, or the simple pull of better grazing. That is why people watch the sky, the wind, and the snow underfoot, not as powers, but as information Allah allowed them to read. If a storm line appeared, the best choice might be to shelter and wait, even if the herd moved on. If the weather stayed stable, the group might travel longer. When the herd was far, the group had to judge whether the chase was worth the energy. If your mind feels busy, you can let it rest on this gentle question: what costs more, walking further, or staying and risking scarcity? The answer changed often. Because herds were valuable, people developed careful ways of approaching them. They did not want to scatter the animals, because panic could ruin the chance for a controlled hunt and could push the herd into unsafe terrain. Instead, they used patience, quiet movement, and awareness of wind direction, because scent travels. They learned to look for natural choke points, like narrow valleys, river crossings, or areas between steep rises. These landscape features could slow animals and make human action more effective. The mood was not celebratory. It was focused and serious, because the goal was survival and responsibility. And when the group succeeded, the work continued afterward through careful processing, sharing, and preserving, so the effort would provide benefit beyond a single day. Preserving food mattered in cold lands, because a good moment might not come again soon. People could dry strips of meat when conditions allowed, and they could protect food from scavengers by choosing smart camp locations. Fat could be stored in simple containers made from skin or other materials, though storage was always temporary and vulnerable to loss. Nothing was guaranteed. That uncertainty encouraged gratitude and carefulness, without turning objects into anything to be adored. If you feel yourself becoming sleepy, you can allow it, while holding one calm detail in mind: hands working slowly near a small fire, making tomorrow a little easier. The fire is only a tool, and any comfort that comes through it is only by Allah's permission. Clothing was not fashion. It was protection. A well-made hide layer could block wind and hold warmth close to the body. People learned which parts of an animal made stronger leather, which pieces made better insulation, and how to stitch seams so they did not split during long walks. A simple needle could be made from bone, and thread could be made from sinew or plant fibers when available. These were quiet technologies, learned without books, taught by demonstration and repetition. The herd's movement influenced this work too, because different seasons demanded different protection. When winter tightened its grip, repairs became urgent. When weather softened, people could travel with less burden. The herd, always moving, shaped the tempo of human preparation like a slow drumbeat. When a group relied on herds, cooperation mattered. One person could not do everything. Someone watched the horizon. Someone gathered fuel. Someone kept tools ready. Someone cared for children. Someone checked the wind and the sky. These roles could shift depending on age, strength, and skill. It was not a rigid system. It was a flexible response to need. The herd, in a way, required human teamwork because the tasks around travel and survival multiplied. If your attention wanders, gently return to the sound of steady walking and the idea of shared work. There is something soothing about a group moving with purpose, not rushing, not arguing, simply doing what must be done. That calm efficiency helped people endure long distances in cold landscapes. Even the choice of campsites often depended on herd behavior. If the animals lingered near a sheltered valley, humans might camp nearby, but not directly in the herd's path. If the herd moved on quickly, the camp might be brief, focused on rest and repair. Camps were often chosen for wind protection, access to fuel, and a clear view of the land. In some regions, people reused familiar spots across years, returning to places that had worked before. This created a kind of quiet geography of memory. Not a map on paper, but a map in the mind. A bend in a river. A ridge that blocks wind. A flat area that stays dry. Small landmarks that became part of a family's long story. The herd also influenced what people carried. Heavy loads slowed travel. Light loads risked being unprepared. So groups learned balance. Some items were essential, like cutting tools, fire-making materials, and repair supplies. Others were chosen depending on season. In colder stretches, extra coverings mattered. In periods of frequent movement, fewer possessions made sense. This constant adjustment is part of what makes the story feel human and ordinary. It is not about grand plans. It is about practical choices. If your body feels tense, you can soften it here, imagining the simple rhythm of packing, walking, resting, and packing again. In that rhythm, the mind naturally begins to slow. The way a long, even road can make thoughts quiet. Sometimes the herd moved into regions where different foods appeared, even in cold climates. Along certain riverbanks, people might find hardy plants, small berries in season, or edible roots when the ground allowed. These were not the main supply, but they could help. People also learned to use animal byproducts for more than food and clothing. Bone could become scrapers for hides. Antlers could become handles or wedges. Some fats could help protect skin from harsh wind, used carefully. Again, none of these materials were treated as mystical. They were simply means, and benefit through them came only by Allah's permission. If you are drifting towards sleep, you can let the details blur gently, keeping only the feeling of steady resourcefulness. In a world tied to herds, timing mattered. If the group arrived too late to a crossing point, the herd might already be gone. If they arrived too early, waiting could drain supplies. So people watched for signs of seasonal change, like shifting wind patterns, snow softness, and animal behavior. They learned that certain migrations tended to begin after certain weather shifts. They did not claim control over nature. They observed it and adapted. This is a quiet form of wisdom. If your thoughts wander, you can return to one simple sentence. They did not force the land, they learned the land. That learning was slow. It took many years, many small mistakes, many careful corrections. And through that gradual learning, humans became capable of traveling long distances without losing their way. There were also social lessons in following herds. A group that argued too much wasted time and energy. A group that shared fairly stayed stronger. When food came in, distribution mattered, because hunger makes people weak and cold makes weakness dangerous. The group had to protect children, support elders, and keep skilled toolmakers able to work. Cooperation was not a moral speech. It was a practical requirement. If you feel your mind pulling toward modern worries, you can set them down for a moment and return to this older simplicity: a small group, a cold horizon, a moving herd, and the steady work of staying alive. There is something grounding about a life built from immediate needs and quiet choices. The relationship between humans and herds also shaped travel routes across generations. When animals repeatedly used the same corridors, humans learned those corridors too. Over time, these routes could stretch far across plains and along ice edges, linking familiar campsites like beads on a string. People could tell stories about these places, not as legends of worship, but as practical memories. Where the river narrows, where the snow stays shallow, where wind protection is best. These shared memories helped younger members learn without writing. If you are getting sleepy, you can let the story feel like a slow walk along one of those corridors, with the world wide and quiet and the pace unhurried. Each step is small, and together they carry you forward. In some years, the herd's numbers might change. Disease, harsh winters, predators, and accidents could reduce populations. When that happened, humans had to adjust. They might rely more on smaller game, fish where possible, or stored supplies if they had any. But in many frozen regions, large herds remained central because they offered concentrated resources. The uncertainty of herd health made people more attentive, not careless. They learned to watch herd condition, noticing if animals looked thin or if movement seemed unusual. This was not superstition. It was observation. If your attention fades, return to the soft idea of watching from a distance, noticing without rushing. The calm act of noticing is part of the sleepiness of this story, like watching snow fall without needing to count the flakes. When people followed herds, they also learned about distance in a physical way. Not in numbers, but in effort. They knew how far a group could walk before exhaustion. They knew how often children needed breaks. They knew when wind would make travel too costly. This knowledge shaped decisions more than any desire for speed. A herd might travel further than humans could manage in a single day, so the group had to predict where the herd would be tomorrow. That prediction was never perfect. It was an educated guess built from experience. If your mind wants certainty, you can relax that need here. This world was shaped by uncertainty, and people learned to live within it, slowly and steadily, choosing the next reasonable step. There is also a quiet emotional side to this. When food depends on following animals, the future can feel fragile. That is why routine mattered. Setting camp in a familiar way, maintaining fire carefully, checking tools, and planning tomorrow's direction could calm the group. Routine is soothing even now, and it was soothing then. If your breathing is shallow, you can deepen it slightly, as if inhaling the clean cold air of that ancient plain, then exhaling slowly into warmth. In that soft rhythm, the story becomes less about survival and more about steadiness. The herd moves. The group adapts. Night comes. Morning returns. This repetition is like a blanket over the mind, lowering the pace of thought. Sometimes people would find signs of other groups following the same herds. Old camp remains, tool fragments, or fire-darkened stones could suggest that others had traveled this way. This could lead to cautious contact, sharing information, or keeping distance depending on circumstances. The herds created natural meeting points because everyone needed similar things. Still, the focus remained practical. Travel, shelter, food, warmth, repair. If you notice your thoughts drifting into complex scenarios, you can return to the simplest thread. The herd is the moving center. It draws attention without speaking. It pulls roots into shape. It turns an empty-looking landscape into a place with direction. And direction, in a frozen world, is a form of comfort. As the seasons shifted again, the herd's movement could feel like a soft signal that life continues. Not endlessly, not permanently, but in cycles that return for a time as Allah wills. People learned to prepare ahead, anticipating when the herd might leave a region. They might repair clothing before it was torn, sharpen tools before they were dull, and rest when rest was available. This gentle foresight is part of what made following herds possible. It was not a dramatic strategy. It was quiet preparation. If you are listening while half asleep, you can let the details fade into a soothing blur of repeated actions. Pack, walk, observe, rest. Pack, walk, observe, rest. The rhythm itself becomes the story. And now, near the end of this segment, the idea can soften even further. Life tied to moving animals meant living with motion, living with change, and finding calm inside uncertainty. The herd did not promise anything. The land did not promise anything. Yet people built a workable life through patience, cooperation, and careful observation by Allah's permission. If your mind wants a strong conclusion, it does not need one here. The herds will keep moving, and the people will keep deciding again and again. In the next part of the story, that careful decision-making becomes even more detailed as we look at how early humans learned to read frozen landscapes like a quiet language, one sign at a time, until sleep feels very close. In the third part of our story, the frozen land becomes something like a quiet page, and early humans learn how to read it. Snow is not just snow. Ice is not just ice. A flat white field can hold information if you move slowly enough to notice. The people who followed herds learned that the ground keeps memories for a short while, then wind and weather erase them. So the skill was not strength first, but attention. They watched what the cold preserved, and they moved before those signs faded. In that way, their journey was guided by details that most of us would walk past without seeing, because we were never trained to look. A single hoofprint could tell a story. If the edges were crisp, the animal passed recently. If the edges were rounded, wind had already worked on it. If fine snow had drifted into the print, more time had passed. If the print was glazed with a thin shine, it might have melted slightly and refrozen, hinting at a brief warm spell or sunlight on that patch. People compared prints side by side, noticing size differences between adults and young, and the uneven spacing that suggested a change of pace. None of this required fancy words, only repeated practice, and the ability Allah allowed them to develop through patience. They also paid attention to direction in a simple way, not by staring at a compass that did not exist, but by reading how animals prefer to move. Herds often angle into wind so scent and sound behave differently, or they travel along ridgelines where snow is thinner. In valleys, tracks can be preserved longer, but also hidden by drifting. On open plains, tracks are visible, but wind wipes them quickly. People learn to scan ahead for subtle lines, like a faint seam where many hooves compress the snow into a slightly darker path. If that seam curved around a hill, the group followed the curve, moving steadily, conserving energy. Wind left its own signatures. It carved ripples in snow, and it built ridges called drifts that could hide holes or uneven ground. A good traveler noticed where wind had scoured a patch nearly bare, creating easier walking, and where it piled snow deep enough to slow everyone down. In some places, the surface became crusty and could cut ankles when it broke. In others, the snow stayed powdery and swallowed feet. People tested with a toe, then adjusted their route. If your mind drifts, it is fine, and you can return to one simple image: wind shaping the snow like quiet waves, and careful footsteps choosing the gentlest line. Even the smallest signs mattered, like frost on plants. If tiny shrubs held heavy hoarfrost, it suggested calm air and deep cold overnight. If the frost was patchy, wind may have been active. Some mornings, the snow surface glittered with loose crystals, and that could mean a recent change in temperature. People used these hints to decide whether travel would be easier now or later. Moving too early could mean brittle cold and painful wind. Moving too late could mean soft snow that steals strength. So they chose timing the way you choose a comfortable position in bed, with small adjustments, listening to the body and the conditions. Animal behavior also became a guide. Herds do not move randomly. They pause where grazing is possible, they cluster when uneasy, and they stretch out when calm. Humans watched for scattered droppings, grazing marks, and trampled patches where many hooves churned snow into roughness. A rested herd leaves a different pattern than a herd in hurry. If the animals had been running, the tracks would be longer, deeper at the front, with wide spacing. If the animals were walking, spacing was even. People followed the calm signs when possible, because calm signs meant predictable movement, and predictability is a kind of comfort in harsh landscapes. Sometimes the land offered misleading clues. A gust of wind could fill tracks in minutes. A light snowfall could blur everything into softness. In such moments, humans relied on broader patterns. They checked multiple places, not one print alone. They climbed small rises to see farther, then returned to the path with new understanding. They remembered where herds tended to go during certain weeks, as long as Allah allowed those patterns to repeat. If you notice thoughts pulling you into modern worries, you can set them down gently and return to this slow method. Look, compare, breathe, and take the next step without rushing. They also learned to read where animals avoided. Thin ice near bends, steep slopes that waste energy, and open areas where wind is harsh. Avoidance can be as informative as presence. A herd's path often chooses the easiest line through a hard world, and humans benefited by choosing that same line. When they saw tracks veering away from a smooth-looking area, they took that warning seriously. It might mean hidden danger or poor footing. So they followed the curve, even if it seemed longer, because safe walking beats fast walking. This is the kind of quiet logic that can make you sleepy, because it is steady and gentle, like choosing the calmest road home. The sky offered guidance too, but not as something to adore. The sun's low arc in cold seasons helped people keep a general sense of direction, and familiar star patterns helped them remember routes at night. These lights were not treated as powers. They were simply part of the world Allah created, used as references when the ground was confusing. A group might notice that a certain bright star rises in a particular area of the sky during a season, and they would use that as a rough marker, while still relying on landscape and tracks. If your attention fades here, let it, and return only to the gentle picture of a dark plain and a steady, quiet sky. Sound was another clue, surprisingly useful in cold air. Frozen air carries certain noises farther. The distant click of ice shifting, the faint calls of birds, the muffled thud of hooves, all could be detected when the world was quiet. People sometimes stopped walking just to listen, because footsteps make their own noise. In deep snow, the sound is soft. On crusty snow, the sound is sharp. They learn to notice these differences under their own feet, using sound to infer what the surface might do next. A hard crust can hold weight for a moment, then collapse. A soft drift can swallow calves. Listening helped them move in a safer rhythm. Smell played a role too, especially with wind. Herd animals carry a distinct scent, and in the right conditions it can drift across open land. Humans might lift their heads and breathe slowly, testing the air. They also smelled the smoke of their own fires on their clothing, and kept it minimal when they needed to stay unnoticed. These were practical choices, not rituals. The point was not secrecy for its own sake, but efficiency. If you are beginning to feel drowsy, you can imagine that slow inhalation, cold air in, warm breath out, and the mind becoming quieter, as if it is learning to listen rather than speak. Tracks were not always hoof prints. Sometimes it was a scraped patch where an animal dug for food, leaving a shallow bowl in the snow. Sometimes it was a line of broken crust where many bodies passed. Sometimes it was hair caught on a branch, or a smear of mud on ice. Even droppings had information, not in a gross way, but in a practical way. Freshness, moisture, and quantity hinted at how recently the herd had been there and how fast it was moving. If your thoughts drift away, it is okay, and you can gently return to the simplest part, a line in the snow leading forward, and a small group deciding to follow it calmly. Over time, this attention turned into shared knowledge. Younger members learned by watching older ones point to details, then by trying to see those details themselves. The teaching was quiet and repetitive. Look at the edge of the print. Look at how the snow crystals sit. Look where the wind piled drift on that side of the ridge. It was slow, and that slowness was useful. It reduced mistakes. It prevented exhaustion. It also created a steady pace for the whole group, which matters when traveling with children and elders. The land did not reward impatience. It rewarded careful observation, like a calm teacher repeating the same lesson until it is understood. Sometimes the best clue was absence. If a known corridor had no tracks at all, it might mean the herd had already shifted routes. A group might then check nearby ridges, riverbanks, or the edge of a forested area if trees existed in that region. They looked for convergence points where animals naturally funnel, like narrow valleys or gaps between rocky outcrops. These features are quiet helpers. They guide movement without speaking, and when humans learned them, they could predict where the herd might appear next, even if the snow had erased the obvious trail. Prediction here was never certain. It was a gentle hypothesis, tested again and again by walking and looking. Cold weather also shaped how long signs lasted. In very dry cold, tracks could remain sharp longer. In warmer conditions, the snow surface softened and then refroze, blurring detail. A light dusting of snow could create a false sense of freshness. People learned to check many indicators at once, not just one. They looked at wind patterns, cloud cover, temperature feel on skin, and the way snow behaved underfoot. If you are still awake, you might notice how soothing this method is. It is slow, and it reduces the need for sudden decisions. And if you are sleepy, you can let the details fade into a soft idea, careful eyes scanning a quiet plain. The human body itself was a measuring tool. They felt when air became damper near a river. They noticed when wind shifted around a hill. They sensed when the surface changed from powder to crust. These sensations were not romanticized. They were practical. In a frozen world, your body informs you whether you are safe, whether you can keep walking, whether you should rest. People learned to respect that information. They stopped before exhaustion became dangerous. They sheltered before a storm arrived fully. This is another gentle rhythm of the story, the rhythm of stopping in time. If your mind wanders, return to that rhythm. Walk, pause, listen, then walk again. Sometimes the group waited on purpose. If the herd was nearby but conditions were poor, waiting could be smarter than moving. They might let wind calm down so they could see tracks more clearly. They might wait for light to improve, because low light can hide subtle signs on snow. Waiting is not failure in this story. Waiting is part of skill. It protects energy. It reduces risk. And it allows the mind to stay calm. You can borrow that calm waiting now. You do not have to chase every thought. You can let thoughts pass like wind over a field, while you stay still and warm in your listening. In certain places, the ground beneath snow changed the surface above. Where grass or shrubs grew, the snow might be slightly raised or textured. Where rocks lay close to the surface, snow might be thinner. Where water flowed under ice, the surface might sag or crack. People learn to notice these changes because herds notice them too. Animals choose efficient routes, and efficient routes often align with safer surfaces. If you are feeling the story pulling you towards sleep, you can imagine following that efficiency, choosing the smooth path, letting effort decrease. The mind likes smooth paths too. It prefers gentle movement over sudden turns, and this story provides that gentleness. As a group became more skilled at reading frozen land, they wasted less energy. They made fewer wrong turns. They found shelter sooner. They arrived at good crossing points more often. This increased survival, but it also increased calm, because panic often comes from not knowing what to do next. Knowledge reduced panic. Knowledge created steadiness. And steadiness is soothing. If you are awake, you can notice how the repeated acts of looking and confirming create a slow comfort. If you are drifting, you can let that comfort be a blanket, heavy but gentle. Look, confirm, move. Look, confirm, rest. The night can hold you while the story continues walking quietly forward. Now the attention can soften again, and the details can become simpler. Picture a wide field of snow, a low sun, and a faint trail that angles toward a distant ridge. The group follows, not as a dramatic pursuit, but as a patient continuation of routine. They read the land the way you might read a familiar room in dim light, by shape and feeling more than sharp detail. If your thoughts become tangled, you can return to one line that repeats softly through the segment. The land holds signs for a short while, and careful eyes find them. The signs fade, and careful feet keep moving. No rush, no strain, just the quiet work of noticing. As we near the end of this segment, the main idea remains gentle and unfinished, because real journeys do not end neatly. Reading frozen land was never a single skill mastered once. It was a practice renewed each day, because snow changes, wind changes, and herds change. People kept learning as long as Allah allowed them time. They did not claim certainty. They accepted that knowledge has limits, and they moved within those limits carefully. If you are sleepy now, you can let your mind rest on a final image. A small group walking under a pale sky, following faint tracks, listening to wind, and letting the land quietly guide them onward, without any need for a strong conclusion. In the fourth part of our story, attention shifts from reading signs to matching pace. Early humans learned that survival across frozen lands depended not on speed, but on rhythm. The herd moved with a pace shaped by hunger, weather, and terrain, and humans who followed learned to let go of urgency. Moving too fast wasted strength. Moving too slow risked losing direction. So they settled into a steady tempo, one that could be maintained for hours without strain. This pace became familiar, almost comforting, like a repeated breathing pattern. If your thoughts feel restless, you can imagine that rhythm now: step, breath, step, breath, slow enough to calm the body, steady enough to keep going. The herd's pace was rarely dramatic. Animals did not sprint unless disturbed. Most of the time, they walked, stopped, grazed, and walked again. Humans mirrored this pattern. They did not march in straight lines. They followed gentle curves, slight rises, and shallow descents. When animals paused, people often paused too, using the time to rest or observe. This created a shared tempo between human and animal movement, even without direct contact. If you feel your attention slipping, that is fine. Just return to the idea of shared rhythm. Not chasing, not lagging, simply moving alongside life as it unfolds, moment by moment, across cold and quiet ground. Matching pace also protected the herd from panic. Sudden movement or loud noise could cause animals to scatter, making travel unpredictable and dangerous. Early humans understood this through experience. They learned to move quietly, to keep gestures small, and to let the animals remain calm. Calm animals followed predictable routes. Predictability reduced risk. This awareness shaped human behavior into something restrained and observant. If you imagine this scene, it may feel almost slow enough to lull you. A wide plain, distant animals, soft footfalls. The absence of hurry becomes its own kind of safety, and safety allows the mind to relax, even in a harsh environment. Children and elders influence pace as much as terrain did. A group could not move faster than its slowest member, and that reality encouraged patience. Rather than pushing weaker members, the group adjusted its expectations. Rest breaks were planned naturally. Short pauses prevented exhaustion later. This shared pacing strengthened bonds and reduced injury. If you are listening while tired, you may notice how gentle this approach feels. There is no pressure to perform, only a shared agreement to keep going together. That agreement, repeated day after day, allowed groups to cross distances that might seem impossible if rushed, but became manageable when divided into calm, steady segments. Cold weather rewarded steady movement. Walking too fast caused sweat, which could freeze later and steal warmth. Walking too slowly caused stiffness and cold to settle in. So people learned a middle way. Enough motion to stay warm, enough restraint to stay dry. This balance required awareness of the body and respect for its limits. If you notice your shoulders tightening, you can soften them here, imagining that balance pace. neither forcing nor stopping, just enough movement to stay comfortable. This bodily wisdom was part of following herds, because animals also move in ways that conserve energy, and humans learn by watching. Terrain often dictated subtle changes in rhythm. On flat ground, steps could be longer and more relaxed. On uneven ground, steps shortened and attention sharpened. Uphill movement slowed naturally. Downhill movement required care to avoid slips. People did not fight these changes. They accepted them. The herd did the same. This acceptance prevented injury and fatigue. If your mind wanders, gently return to this image of adjustment without complaint. A small rise slows the group. A smooth stretch lets them ease forward. The land sets the tempo, and the group listens. That listening is quiet, steady, and deeply calming. The sound of movement mattered. On powdery snow, footsteps whispered. On crusted snow, they cracked softly. People learned to recognize these sounds and adjust. Loud cracking could alert animals or signal unstable footing. Softer sound meant better conditions. This awareness encouraged lighter steps and careful foot placement. Over time, the group moved almost silently, not as a trick, but as a natural result of attentiveness. If you feel your thoughts becoming heavy, you can imagine that softness now. Each step placed gently, each sound muted. The world feels wrapped in quiet, and your breathing can follow that same gentle hush. Resting was part of the pace, not a failure of it. Short rests allowed muscles to recover and minds to reset. People might lean on tools, sit briefly on packs, or stand still and breathe. They did not collapse unless forced by exhaustion. They learned to stop early rather than late. This habit reduced injury and preserved strength for when it was truly needed. If you are listening in bed, you can mirror this approach. You do not need to hold yourself alert. You can rest into the story, knowing it will continue at a pace that does not demand effort from you. Food intake also influenced rhythm. Small amounts eaten regularly supported steady energy better than large meals taken rarely. People carried simple food when possible and ate during pauses. This prevented weakness and dizziness during travel. Animals did something similar, grazing as they moved. This parallel behavior reinforced the shared rhythm between herd and human. If you feel sleepy, you can let that parallel sink in. Both human and animal move, pause, nourish, and move again. The pattern is ancient and reliable, and it asks very little from the mind except gentle attention. Weather shifts required flexible pacing. When wind strengthened, people leaned into it, shortened steps, and reduced exposed skin. When wind calmed, movement could relax again. During snowfall, visibility dropped, and pace slowed to maintain direction. In clear weather, longer stretches became possible. None of this was dramatic. It was a constant series of small adjustments. If your thoughts feel scattered, imagine those adjustments smoothing them out. A little slower here, a little steadier there. The story does not rush toward a peak. It flows like a long walk that continues simply because walking is what comes next. The herd itself provided feedback on pacing. If animals began to bunch together, it might signal unease. Humans responded by slowing or stopping. If animals spread out and grazed calmly, humans felt safer maintaining distance and direction. This responsive pacing reduced surprises. It allowed people to anticipate rather than react. Anticipation, when gentle, reduces stress. If you are still awake, you might notice how this reduces tension even in the telling. The future feels less threatening when movement is measured and informed, and that feeling can help the body release its grip on wakefulness. Night travel was rare in frozen lands, but when necessary, pacing became even more cautious. Limited visibility increased risk, so steps shortened further. People listened more than they looked. They followed familiar terrain or well-known routes rather than exploring new ground. This conservative approach preserved safety. If you imagine this scene, it may feel especially quiet. Darkness, soft breath, careful movement. The absence of haste becomes almost tangible. This is a good place for the mind to slow, because nothing is demanded quickly and everything unfolds with care. Tools influence pace as well. Carrying heavy tools slowed movement, so people balanced usefulness against weight. Some items were cached in known locations to reduce load during long follows. This allowed the group to maintain a comfortable rhythm without strain. The herd, too, carried only what it needed, in the form of its own body. This parallel simplicity reinforced a shared logic. If you feel your thoughts drifting toward excess detail, you can let them simplify here. Only what is needed. Only what helps maintain the pace. Everything else can be left behind. Injuries forced further adjustments. A twisted ankle, a strained muscle, or frostbitten skin required slower travel or longer rests. The group adapted because pushing an injured member could cost more later. This patience preserved the group as a whole. It also reinforced trust, because everyone knew they would be supported if weakened. Trust reduces anxiety, and reduced anxiety allows steadier movement. If you are listening with a tired body, you may feel a quiet comfort in that idea. Movement that cares for the whole group feels safer than movement driven by pressure. Over long distances, pacing became almost automatic. The body learned what felt sustainable, and the mind relaxed into repetition. Walk, breathe, observe, pause, walk again. This repetition is deeply calming. It removes the need for constant decision-making. If your mind is still active, you can gently let it ride this repetition, like rocking back and forth slowly. The story does not ask you to solve anything. It simply invites you to share this ancient rhythm, one that carried people across cold lands without urgency or drama. The pace also shaped how people experience time. Days felt long, but not rushed. Progress was measured in familiarity, not distance. A known ridge meant something achieved. A familiar valley meant reassurance. This way of experiencing time reduces pressure. There is no countdown. There is only continuation. If you feel the urge to check the clock or think ahead, you can set that aside here. Let time stretch gently, like the horizon itself, wide and unhurried. As the group settled into this rhythm, even harsh environments felt manageable. Not comfortable, but understandable. Understanding reduces fear. Fear drains energy. By maintaining a steady pace, people conserved both physical and mental resources. This conservation is a quiet strength. If you notice yourself feeling calmer, that is a natural response. The story is built to slow the nervous system, just as that steady pace slowed the bodies of those who lived it. Now, as this segment softens toward its end, the idea of pace remains open and unresolved, as it was in life. There was no final speed to reach, no perfect rhythm that stayed forever. Conditions changed, bodies aged, herds altered routes. The pace adapted again and again. If you are growing sleepy, you can let that adaptation mirror your own. You do not need to stay alert. You can let your awareness slow, trusting that movement continues even when attention fades. In the quiet distance, the herd keeps moving. The people keep following. The pace remains gentle, measured, and responsive. There is no sudden conclusion here, only continuation. And as you rest, you can allow that continuation to carry you softly forward, step by step, breath by breath, until the rhythm itself becomes enough and sleep feels very close. In the fifth part of our story, the cold itself becomes a constant presence, not an enemy to fight, but a condition to live within. Early humans who followed herds across frozen lands did not imagine the cold would disappear. They accepted it as part of the world Allah created, and they learned how to move through it with care. Cold shaped every decision, from how long to walk, to when to stop, to how much energy could be spent. Understanding cold meant understanding limits. And limits, when respected, allowed life to continue in places that seem empty and silent to us today. Cold affected the body quietly at first. Fingers stiffened. Breath grew sharper. Skin felt tight. These sensations were warnings, not dramatic signals, and people learned to listen to them early. Waiting too long to respond could lead to injury. So gloves, wraps, and lead coverings were adjusted often. Movement was balanced with rest to prevent sweat from freezing. If you feel your hands relaxing as you listen, imagine them warmed slowly near a small fire. Not rushed, not forced. Just steady warmth returning by Allah's permission through simple means. Clothing was one of the most important responses to cold. Hides were cleaned, stretched, and shaped to block wind and hold warmth. Fur faced inward for insulation, and outer layers were treated to resist moisture. Stitching had to be tight, because gaps allowed cold air to creep in. These garments were not decorative. They were practical answers to a serious environment. Repairs happened constantly, because wear was unavoidable. If your attention drifts, return to this image of hands working slowly, fixing a seam by firelight, preparing for tomorrow without hurry. Shelter choices mattered just as much as clothing. People looked for land shapes that reduced wind exposure, such as shallow hollows, ridges, or natural barriers. Even a small rise could block a cutting wind. Temporary shelters were built with available materials, often combining hides, snow, and simple frameworks. These structures were not meant to last forever. They were meant to work for now. This acceptance of temporary solutions reduced stress. If you are listening in a quiet room, you can imagine that shelter now, low, warm, and quiet, holding back the cold without claiming permanence. Fire required constant attention in cold regions. It provided warmth, light, and the ability to prepare food. But fire also demanded fuel, and fuel was not always easy to find. People gathered it carefully and used it wisely. Flames were kept small and steady rather than large and wasteful. Sparks were controlled. Embers were protected. Fire was never treated as something to be honored or praised. It was a tool, and any benefit that came through it was only by Allah's permission. If you feel your breathing slow, imagine that steady flame, quiet and reliable. Cold also influenced how people ate. High-energy foods became more important, especially fats, which helped maintain body heat. Meals were planned to support long periods of movement and recovery. Eating too much at once could make travel uncomfortable. Eating too little could weaken the body. So food was shared in moderate portions, timed with rest. This careful balance kept people functioning over long stretches of cold. If you feel sleepy, let that balance guide your thoughts. Not too much stimulation. Not too little. Just enough to remain comfortable. Water presented a challenge in frozen landscapes. Rivers and streams might be covered with ice, and snow had to be melted when liquid water was unavailable. This required fuel and time, both valuable. People learned where water was more likely to flow beneath ice and how to access it safely. They also learned to recognize dangerous ice conditions. Dehydration could worsen cold injuries, so maintaining water intake mattered even when thirst was less noticeable. If your thoughts wander, you can return to the simple image of snow slowly melting into water, a quiet transformation that supports life by Allah's permission. Sleep in the cold was different from sleep in warmer places. Bodies had to be protected from heat loss, and sleeping positions were chosen to conserve warmth. People slept close together when appropriate, sharing heat. Coverings were arranged carefully to prevent drafts. Sleep was lighter, interrupted by the need to tend fire or adjust layers. Yet it was still restorative when done well. If you are listening while lying down, you can imagine that careful settling now. Adjusting, covering, letting the body rest while the cold remains outside the shelter. Travel in extreme cold required awareness of daylight. Short days limited how far people could safely move. Darkness increased risk, so planning mattered. Groups aimed to reach shelter before light faded. If caught out, they chose safe stopping points rather than pushing blindly forward. This respect for daylight shaped daily rhythm. If you feel your eyelids growing heavy, you can imagine the early nights settling over a frozen plain, the work of the day done, and the quiet acceptance of rest. Cold weather also affected tools. Materials became brittle. Wood could crack. Stone could shatter differently. People adjusted how they used tools, striking with care and protecting delicate items. Metal tools were not yet available in these periods, so everything depended on natural materials. This fragility encouraged gentler handling and more frequent maintenance. If your mind is busy, let it rest on this careful handling. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is slammed. Everything is done with awareness, because breaking a tool could mean real difficulty later. Movement itself generated warmth, but only when done steadily. Bursts of fast movement caused sweat, which later froze and stole heat. So people learned to keep a consistent pace, as described earlier, allowing warmth to build gradually and remain stable. This understanding connected cold management with pacing. The two could not be separated. If you are still awake, you might notice how this reinforces the story's calm rhythm. Everything supports everything else. Pace supports warmth. Warmth supports clarity. Clarity supports good decisions. Hands and feet required special care. Fingers and toes lose heat quickly, and numbness could lead to injury. People checked each other's hands and faces, watching for pale patches or stiffness. This mutual care was practical, not sentimental. Catching problems early prevented worse outcomes. If you feel your own hands resting comfortably now, you can let them relax fully, imagining them safely warm, no effort required. Cold also shaped how long people could remain still. Standing too long caused heat loss. Sitting directly on cold ground drained warmth. So rests were brief or involved insulation. People leaned against packs, sat on hides, or stood moving gently. This constant awareness of heat flow became second nature. If you notice your body settling deeper into rest, that is fine. You are not on cold ground. You are safe to be still, while the story remembers a world where stillness required care. Storms were the most serious cold-related danger. Sudden wind and snowfall could disorient and exhaust a group. Early humans learned to read early signs of storms and to shelter before conditions worsened. Waiting out a storm was often wiser than moving. This patience saved lives. If your thoughts feel scattered, imagine that waiting now. Shelter closed. Wind outside. Stillness inside. Waiting is not weakness here. It is wisdom. Over time, people developed an emotional resilience to cold. Fear lessened as understanding grew. The cold became familiar, predictable in its own way. Familiarity does not make something easy, but it makes it manageable. If you are drifting towards sleep, you can let that sense of manageability soothe you. The world feels less threatening when its patterns are understood, even partially. Children learned about cold through experience and guidance. They were taught to cover skin, to move when necessary, and to listen to discomfort. This knowledge passed quietly through generations. No written instructions, no ceremonies, just repetition and correction. If you are half asleep, you can let this gentle teaching fade into the background, like a soft voice that reassures without demanding attention. Even animals showed humans how to live with cold. Watching how herds positioned themselves against wind, or how they rested, offered clues. Animals often turned their backs to wind or clustered together. Humans noticed and adapted similar strategies. This observation did not involve admiration or belief. It involved learning. If your thoughts wander, return to that simple act of learning by watching, calm and unhurried. As days passed, cold became a constant companion rather than a crisis. It shaped habits, decisions, and movement, but it did not dominate thought every moment. Life continued within it. People talked, worked, rested, and planned as well as they could. If you are still awake, you may feel a quiet respect for this steadiness. If you are sleepy, you can let that steadiness hold you. Now, as this segment comes to a soft close, there is no dramatic victory over the cold. There is only adaptation. The cold remains. The people remain. And the relationship continues, day after day, step after step, as long as Allah allows. You can let this understanding settle gently, like snow falling without wind, quiet and even, as your mind relaxes and rest feels closer, without any need for a strong ending. In the sixth part of our story, attention turns from the land and the cold to the people themselves, especially how entire groups moved together. Following herds across frozen lands was never a task for one person alone. It involved children, adults, and elders, each with different abilities and limits. Survival depended on keeping the group intact. No one was left behind casually, because every person mattered. This understanding shaped how far they traveled each day and how decisions were made. The group moved at a pace that protected its most vulnerable members, and that choice, repeated again and again, made long journeys possible. Children were part of these movements from a young age. They learned by walking, watching, and copying. Short legs meant shorter strides, so adults adjusted their pace. When children tired, the group rested. Sometimes children were carried for short distances, but carrying too much weight for too long was not possible. So planning mattered. Camps were placed where the next day's walk would not overwhelm the youngest members. If your mind feels busy, you can soften it here by imagining that careful consideration, a group that slows down not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Elders also shaped movement. Their experience was valuable, even if their bodies moved more slowly. Elders remembered routes, weather patterns, and past mistakes. Their guidance helped avoid danger. So the group listened, even when it meant stopping or choosing a longer path. Supporting elders required patience, but patience paid back in knowledge. If you are listening while tired, you may feel comfort in this balance. Strength and wisdom worked together. Neither rushed the other. The journey continued because everyone had a place within it. Group decisions were rarely sudden. When the herd changed direction or conditions shifted, people discussed quietly or observed together. Voices were low. Gestures were small. Agreement formed slowly. This reduced conflict and confusion. Everyone needed to understand the plan, because everyone would carry it out. If your thoughts drift, return to this calm decision-making. No shouting. No urgency. Just shared attention focused on the same horizon. That shared focus made movement smoother and reduced anxiety, which mattered as much as physical strength in cold environments. Carrying responsibilities were divided naturally. Some adults focused on watching the herd. Others gathered fuel or checked terrain. Some kept tools ready. Some watched children. This division was flexible, changing with need and energy. No role was fixed forever. If someone was tired or injured, others adjusted. This flexibility kept the group resilient. If you feel tension leaving your shoulders, that is natural. A system that adapts gently is easier to rest within, even as a listener imagining it. Meals were shared with group balance in mind. Children and elders often ate first or received extra care because their reserves were smaller. This was not ceremony. It was practicality. A weak child or elder could slow the entire group later. Sharing food thoughtfully protected future movement. If you feel sleepy, let this quiet care settle in your mind. The story does not hurry. It circles around the idea that looking after one another was not optional. It was part of survival itself. Rest periods were planned with the group's needs in mind. Children needed frequent pauses. Elders needed time to ease stiff joints. Adults needed moments to check tools and clothing. These pauses were not wasted time. They prevented injuries and exhaustion. If you are lying down while listening, you can mirror this rhythm. You do not need to hold your body tense. You can let it rest now, knowing that in this story, rest is part of progress, not an obstacle to it. When illness or injury occurred, the group adjusted expectations. Travel slowed. Camps lasted longer. Sometimes routes were shortened. Pushing forward despite weakness often led to worse outcomes, so restraint became a form of strength. This approach required trust, because everyone had to believe that slowing down now would protect the group later. Trust grew through repeated experiences where patience proved useful. If your mind wanders, gently return to that trust, quiet and steady, holding the group together like a soft thread. Children learned responsibility early, but gently. They carried small items, watched for signs, and helped with simple tasks. This involvement built confidence and skill over time. No one expected perfection. Mistakes were part of learning. If you feel drowsy, let this gentle learning wash over you. There is no pressure here, only gradual growth. The story moves at the pace of understanding, not performance. Elders often served as calm centers during uncertainty. When weather changed suddenly or the herd's behavior was unclear, elders reminded the group of similar situations from the past. These reminders reduced panic. Memory became a stabilizing force. If you are still awake, notice how memory itself acts like a shelter in this story, protecting the group from impulsive decisions. If you are sleepy, you can let that shelter feel warm and quiet. Disagreements did happen, but survival discouraged prolonged conflict. Energy spent arguing was energy not spent walking, gathering fuel, or staying warm. So people learned to compromise. This did not mean everyone always agreed. It meant decisions moved forward without lingering tension. If your thoughts feel tangled, imagine those tensions loosening here. The story favors resolution through calm acceptance rather than victory. Nighttime emphasized group closeness. In cold darkness, people stayed near one another. Children slept between adults. Elders rested where they could be checked easily. Firelight connected faces and reduced isolation. This closeness was practical, but it also reduced fear. If you feel your breathing slow, imagine that firelight now, steady and soft, illuminating a small circle of people while the vast cold remains outside. Storytelling and quiet conversation sometimes filled evenings, but often silence did too. Silence was not uncomfortable. It allowed listening, both to the environment and to one's own body. Children learned that silence could be safe. Elders used silence to observe. If you are drifting towards sleep, this is a good place to let words soften. Silence does not need explanation here. It is simply part of group life. Group movement also created emotional reassurance. Knowing you were not alone made harsh conditions easier to face. A shared burden feels lighter, even when physically heavy. If you are listening alone, you can still feel that reassurance through the story. The group moves together. No one walks entirely alone across the frozen land. Over long journeys, relationships deepened. People learned each other's strengths and limits. They anticipated needs without words. This familiarity reduced mistakes. It also reduced fear, because predictability within the group balanced unpredictability outside it. If your mind wanders, return to this sense of familiarity. Repetition creates comfort. Comfort allows rest. Children who grew up in these moving groups carried the memory forward. When they became adults, they remembered how elders had slowed the group at the right moments. They remembered being supported. This memory shaped future decisions. Knowledge and care traveled together across generations. If you are sleepy, you can let that continuity feel soothing, like a long thread unbroken by haste. Group life required constant awareness, but not constant tension. Much of the time, movement became routine. Walk, pause, adjust, rest. This routine allowed minds to relax even while bodies worked. If you feel your thoughts slowing, that is natural. The story is built on repetition, and repetition is calming. As seasons changed, group composition changed too. Children grew stronger. Elders aged further. Roles shifted, yet the principle remained the same. The group moved together, adapting its pace and expectations. If you are still awake, notice how flexible this system is. If you are drifting, let that flexibility support your own relaxation. Even loss was faced as a group. When someone could no longer continue, the impact was shared. Grief existed, but life continued because it had to. This continuation was not denial. It was acceptance. If your mind touches sadness here, let it remain gentle. The story does not linger on pain. It acknowledges it quietly, then continues walking. Now, as this segment draws toward a soft close, the image remains open. A group moves across frozen land, children and elders among them, pace adjusted, decisions shared. There is no dramatic ending, because group life is ongoing. You can let that ongoing movement fade into calm repetition, allowing your own thoughts to slow, knowing the journey continues quietly, without urgency, as rest comes closer. In the seventh part of our story, the frozen land begins to reveal its hidden pathways. These were not roads built by people, but routes shaped by water, ice, wind, and time. Early humans learned that certain paths appeared again and again, guiding both animals and people across wide, cold regions. Frozen rivers, open plains, and seasonal ice bridges became natural corridors. Following these pathways was not an act of confidence, but of humility. People moved where the land allowed easier passage, accepting guidance rather than forcing direction, and that acceptance made long journeys possible. Frozen rivers were among the most reliable routes. When solid, they offered smooth surfaces with fewer obstacles than deep snow. Herds often followed river valleys because water shaped gentler slopes and exposed grazing areas nearby. Humans learned to test ice carefully before committing weight, checking thickness and color. Once safe, travel became more efficient. The river guided direction without signs or words. If you feel your attention drift, return to the image of a wide, frozen river stretching quietly into the distance, offering a path that feels almost restful underfoot. Plains also created pathways, especially where wind swept snow away. In these places, walking required less effort, and animals naturally chose them. Humans noticed these patterns and followed. These open areas could be vast, but familiarity grew over time. A certain cluster of stones, a distant hill, or a change in snow texture became markers. If you are listening while tired, let those markers blur gently. You do not need to hold sharp images. Just imagine open space and a sense of forward movement that does not rush. Ice bridges formed seasonally where water froze thickly beteen landmasses. These bridges were temporary and required careful judgment. Animals crossed them first, and humans watched closely. A well-used animal crossing signaled relative safety, though never certainty. Timing mattered. Crossed too early, and ice might be thin. Crossed too late, and thaw could weaken it. People learn to wait for the right window. If your thoughts wander, return to this waiting. Waiting is not empty time here. It is attentive stillness, preparing for safe movement. Mountain passes, when present, acted as funnels. Snow collected differently in these narrow spaces, sometimes packing hard and allowing passage, sometimes blocking it entirely. Herds tested these passes, and humans learned from their success or retreat. Choosing a pass meant committing to a direction for some time. This decision was weighed carefully. If you are awake, notice how calm that weighing feels in the telling. There is no rush. If you are sleepy, let that calm weigh on your mind like a gentle blanket. Coastal ice edges also became routes in certain regions. Where land met frozen sea, animals and people found flatter terrain and access to different resources. Ice here could be unpredictable, influenced by tides and currents. Humans learned to recognize safer stretches by watching cracks, ridges, and the behavior of animals. This knowledge was specific and local, passed down through experience. If your mind drifts, imagine that narrow edge where land and ice meet, quiet and pale, guiding careful steps forward. Natural corridors were not chosen once and forgotten. They were tested repeatedly. Each season, each journey, reaffirmed or challenged what was known. A river might freeze differently one year. A pass might block another. So people stayed flexible, ready to adapt. This adaptability reduced disappointment and danger. If you feel tension leaving your body, that is natural. A mindset that expects change is easier to rest within than one that demands certainty. Animals often revealed routes humans might miss. Herds instinctively chose paths with less resistance, conserving their own energy. By watching animals climb slopes or avoid certain areas, humans gained insight. They did not assume animals were perfect guides, but they trusted animal experience as a starting point. If you are sleepy, let that trust soften your thoughts. Following, in this sense, does not mean surrender. It means learning from what already moves successfully through the land. These pathways also shaped memory. People remembered where travel felt easier and where it felt dangerous. Over time, these memories became shared knowledge, passed quietly through demonstration. Younger members learned routes by walking them, not by hearing long explanations. The land itself became the teacher. If your attention wanders, return to that idea. Learning without words. Understanding through repetition. This gentle method requires patience, but it also brings calm. Natural routes reduced energy cost, which mattered greatly in cold environments. Saving energy meant fewer injuries and more resilience during hard periods. This efficiency was not greed. It was wisdom. If you imagine walking through deep snow versus along a windswept ridge, the difference is clear even without experience. The body naturally relaxes when effort decreases. If you are listening in bed, let your own body relax in response to this imagined ease. Some routes connected familiar campsites, forming long chains of movement across regions. People could move from one known shelter to another, planning travel in manageable sections. This broke vast distances into smaller, less intimidating pieces. If you feel your thoughts racing, imagine distance breaking down now, becoming a series of small, achievable steps. One camp, one ridge, one river. The journey becomes gentler when viewed this way. These natural pathways also influenced encounters with other groups. Where routes converged, people might meet others following the same herds. These encounters could be cautious, neutral, or cooperative. The route itself created the meeting, not intention. If you feel the story pulling you toward complexity, let it simplify again. The focus here is the path, not the meeting. The path remains quiet and steady, regardless of who uses it. Seasonal repetition strengthened confidence in these routes. When a path worked 1 year, people expected it might work again, though never with full certainty. This expectation reduced fear and hesitation. Confidence here was not arrogance. It was familiarity. If you are drifting towards sleep, you can let familiarity soothe you. Known paths require less mental effort, allowing the mind to rest even while the body moves. Sometimes routes had to be abandoned mid-journey. A thaw, a storm, or a shift in herd movement could make a once safe path dangerous. Turning back was not shameful. It was sensible. This willingness to retreat preserved life. If your mind resists the idea of turning back, you can let that resistance soften. In this story, changing direction is a sign of understanding, not failure. Natural pathways also shaped how people perceived space. The world felt organized around these corridors. Areas off the path felt more distant, less certain. This perception helped prioritize movement and decision-making. If you notice your thoughts wandering into unfamiliar worries, return to the path image. Staying on the path here is not confinement. It is comfort. Ice, wind, and water continually reshape these routes. A path that existed last season might vanish under snowdrifts or cracks. People learned to reassess constantly. This reassessment kept them attentive but not anxious. If you are still awake, notice how attentiveness without urgency feels. If you are sleepy, let that balanced attention fade into rest. Even the act of choosing a route involved group discussion and observation. People spread out slightly to inspect options, then regrouped. Decisions emerged gradually. This process reduced mistakes. If you are listening while tired, imagine that regrouping now, coming back together, choosing calmly, moving on without drama. The land itself seemed to guide movement through these pathways, but without intention or promise. People did not attribute purpose to the land. They recognized patterns and responded. This recognition kept beliefs grounded in observation rather than imagination. If your mind drifts, return to that groundedness. Snow, ice, wind, all present, all quiet. As the group traveled these routes repeatedly, their confidence grew, but humility remained. They knew that the land could change. This humility prevented complacency. If you feel calm now, That calm is similar. It does not deny uncertainty. It rests within it. Now, as this segment gently closes, the image remains open. A frozen river stretching ahead. A windswept plain beyond. An ice bridge waiting for the right moment. The people stand, observe, and then move, following natural pathways shaped long before them and reshaped after them. There is no final destination here, only continued movement, and that movement can fade softly into rest as your attention drifts, unhurried and at ease. In the 8th part of our story, uncertainty quietly takes center stage. Even with careful observation, familiar routes, and steady pacing, herds did not always behave as expected. Sometimes they turned suddenly. Sometimes they slowed, scattered, or disappeared into terrain that made no sense at first glance. Early humans learned that these moments required calm more than action. Reacting too quickly often made things worse. So when the herd changed direction, the group paused. Not in panic, but in stillness, allowing the land and the animals to reveal what was happening. A sudden turn by the herd could mean many things. Weather might be shifting ahead. Predators could be present. Grazing conditions might have changed. Humans did not guess wildly. They watched body language. Were the animals tense or relaxed? Were they moving fast or slowly drifting? These details mattered. If you feel your thoughts rushing ahead, you can slow them here. This part of the story is about stopping movement for a moment and letting understanding catch up. Pausing did not mean standing idle. People spread out slightly, scanning the terrain from different angles. Someone might climb a small rise. Someone else might check wind direction. Another might look back to confirm earlier tracks. These quiet checks built a fuller picture. No one shouted conclusions. Information gathered slowly. If you are listening while tired, imagine that gentle spreading out, then coming back together, each person bringing a small piece of clarity. Waiting also conserved energy. Chasing a herd blindly could lead to exhaustion with no reward. Early humans learned that it was better to lose time than strength. Strength was harder to regain. This understanding shaped patience into a survival skill. If your body feels heavy, you can let it rest here. The story itself pauses, breathing evenly, allowing you to feel that waiting does not have to be uncomfortable. It can be restorative. Sometimes the herd's change was temporary. Animals might circle around an obstacle or regroup after disturbance. Humans who waited often saw the herd resume a familiar direction. This confirmed the value of patience. Acting too early would have meant unnecessary detours. If you notice your mind jumping to conclusions, let it settle. The story reminds us that not every change demands immediate response. Some changes resolve themselves if given space. Other times, the change was permanent. The herd might commit to a new route. In these cases, humans reassessed carefully. They compared the new direction with known terrain. Was there shelter ahead? Water? Safer ground? They did not follow blindly. Following always involved choice. If you feel sleepy, let that careful choosing soften your thoughts. No pressure. Just quiet evaluation, one factor at a time. Children and elders influenced how long the group could wait. Waiting too long could strain supplies or patience. Waiting too little could lead to mistakes. Balancing these needs required calm leadership and shared understanding. The group adjusted expectations together. If you are drifting towards sleep, you can imagine that shared understanding now. No arguments, just quiet agreement forming over time. Weather played a major role in these moments. A herd might turn to avoid rising wind or incoming snow. Humans learned to look ahead, not just at the animals. Darkening clouds, changing light, or shifts in temperature offered context. Understanding the reason behind a turn helped predict what might happen next. If your thoughts wander, bring them back to this layered attention. Animals, sky, wind, land, all considered together. Sometimes the safest choice was to stop following entirely, at least for a while. The group might choose to camp and wait for clearer signs. This was not failure. It was adaptation. Camps became places of reassessment. Tools were checked. Clothing repaired. Food measured. Waiting became productive. If you are listening in bed, this is a good place to let your body fully relax. The story is resting here too. Silence often accompanied these decisions. Silence allowed listening. It prevented unnecessary stress. In silence, small sounds became noticeable. Wind over ice. Distant movement. These sounds informed the next choice. If your mind is noisy, you can let silence grow inside it now. The story does not need commentary. It holds meaning even when quiet. Animals sometimes returned after disappearing. A herd might vanish over a ridge, only to reappear later along a different line. Humans learned not to assume absence meant loss. This reduced panic. If you feel anxiety rising about losing track, let it ease. The story teaches trust in observation over fear. Things unfold in their own time. Group memory helped in uncertain moments. Elders recalled similar situations from years before. They remembered herds changing direction near certain landmarks or seasons. These memories grounded decisions. If you are still awake, notice how memory stabilizes the present. If you are sleepy, let those memories blur into a sense of reassurance. Not every pause ended with a clear answer. Sometimes the group chose a direction without full certainty. They accepted risk, but managed it carefully. They chose paths that allowed correction if needed. This flexibility mattered. If you feel pressure to be certain about everything, you can release that pressure here. The story accepts partial knowledge as enough to move forward gently. The herd's unpredictability also taught humility. Humans learned they were not in control. They responded rather than commanded. This attitude reduced frustration. If your thoughts feel rigid, let them soften. The story invites flexibility, not force. These moments of uncertainty slowed the overall journey, but they increased survival. Fewer injuries. Fewer wasted efforts. Over time, patience became a habit. Waiting felt natural rather than stressful. If you are drifting towards sleep, that habit can become your own now. Waiting without tension. Resting without guilt. Children observed these pauses and learned that stillness had value. They saw adults stop, think, and choose carefully. This lesson stayed with them. If you are half asleep, let that lesson settle gently. Stillness can be wise. When the group finally moved again, the movement felt more confident. Even if the path was new, the decision had been considered. This reduced fear. If you notice calm spreading, that is natural. Calm often follows thoughtful pauses. As the group resumed following, they watched closely for confirmation. Fresh tracks. Familiar terrain. Predictable animal behavior. These signs reassured them. If you are awake, you can notice how reassurance arrives quietly, not dramatically. If you are sleepy, you can let that reassurance lull you further. Not every uncertainty resolved fully. Some questions remained unanswered. That was accepted. Life continued anyway. If your mind seeks closure, you can let that need rest. The story does not promise certainty. It offers steadiness instead. Now, as this segment gently fades, the image remains unresolved. A group stands, having paused, now beginning to move again, not rushing, not frozen, simply continuing. The herd is ahead somewhere, the land open, the future unknown. And that openness can feel calm rather than threatening, allowing your thoughts to drift, slow, and rest without needing a final answer. In the ninth part of our story, the focus widens from daily movement to long-term learning. By following herds across frozen lands, early humans were quietly taught about the world itself. Every journey added a layer of understanding, not through sudden discovery, but through repetition. Over many seasons, people began to recognize patterns in weather, terrain, animal behavior, and time. This knowledge was not written down or celebrated. It simply accumulated, shaping choices in subtle ways that made survival more likely and life more predictable, as much as anything could be in such an environment. One of the first lessons was geography. Following herds carried people across wide regions, introducing them to valleys, plains, ridges, and river systems. They learned where land rose gently and where it dropped sharply. They learned which areas stayed frozen longer and which thawed earlier. This understanding came from walking, not from study. The body remembered distances and slopes. If your thoughts wander, return to that simple idea. Learning through movement. Each step teaches something small, and over time, those small lessons form a quiet map in the mind. Weather patterns also became familiar. People noticed when winds tended to change direction, when snowfall was likely, and when clear skies followed storms. They learned to associate certain cloud shapes with upcoming cold or calm. These observations were practical, not mystical. No belief was placed in the sky itself. The sky was watched because it provided information. If you feel sleepy, let that watching feel gentle. Eyes scanning clouds without urgency. Understanding grows slowly, and the mind does not need to stay sharp to absorb it. Following herds taught humans about seasonal timing. Animals moved in response to changes that people could not always sense immediately. By watching herds, humans learned when seasons shifted, sometimes before the cold or warmth fully arrived. This allowed preparation. Clothing repairs, tool maintenance, and camp planning happened earlier rather than later. If you are still awake, notice how anticipation reduces stress. Preparing before hardship arrives feels calmer than reacting after. If you are drifting, you can let that calm anticipation ease you toward rest. Astronomy, in its simplest form, also emerged from long journeys. People noticed recurring star patterns during certain times of year. These patterns helped confirm direction and season. They were not treated as objects of power or reverence. They were references, like landmarks in the sky. If your mind drifts, imagine that steady sky now, familiar and quiet, offering orientation without demanding attention. The sky does not speak. It simply exists, and people learned to notice its consistency. Time itself became something people understood through movement. Days of walking, nights of rest, and the return of familiar conditions created a rhythm. Time was not measured in numbers, but in experiences. The length of a journey, the feel of cold deepening, the moment when daylight shortened noticeably. If you feel the story slowing your thoughts, that is natural. Time here is not counted. It is felt, and feeling time often allows the mind to relax. Animal behavior taught lessons beyond survival. Watching herds revealed how animals responded to danger, scarcity, and comfort. Humans learned the value of staying calm under stress, because panicked movement wasted energy. They learned the value of sticking together, because isolated animals were more vulnerable. These observations influenced human behavior quietly. If your mind wanders, you can return to that mirror between human and animal movement. Both seek balance. Both avoid unnecessary strain. Knowledge gained from following herds was shared across generations. Elders told stories, but more often, they demonstrated. They led younger members along familiar routes. They pointed out signs. They corrected mistakes gently. This method of teaching was slow but effective. If you are feeling drowsy, let that gentle teaching fade into the background, like a quiet voice that reassures without demanding focus. Mistakes also taught important lessons. A wrong turn, a misjudged crossing, or a poorly timed movement left strong impressions. These experiences were remembered because they carried consequences. Over time, the group learned to avoid repeating them. If your thoughts feel heavy, remember that learning does not require perfection. It grows through trial, reflection, and adjustment. This acceptance can be calming, even now. Following herds also revealed the scale of the world. People realized how far animals could travel and how connected distant regions were. A herd seen in one place might reappear hundreds of miles away months later. This awareness expanded human perception beyond immediate surroundings. If you are listening while tired, Imagine that expanded view gently, not overwhelming, just wide. A wide view often makes small worries feel less sharp. The repeated act of observation sharpened human senses. People became better at noticing subtle changes in sound, smell, and texture. These heightened senses were not constant tension. They became natural. When awareness becomes habitual, it no longer feels tiring. If your mind feels alert but calm, that is similar. Awareness does not always require effort. Sometimes it feels like quiet presence. Environmental knowledge gained from herds influenced where people chose to settle temporarily. Camps were placed where future movement would be easier, not just where immediate comfort existed. This forward thinking reduced risk. If you feel your mind racing ahead, you can let it slow here. Forward thinking in this story is gentle, not anxious. It considers tomorrow without abandoning today. Over time, following herds contributed to broader migration. Groups gradually moved into new regions as animals expanded or shifted ranges. These movements were slow and unplanned. No one set out to cross continents. They simply followed food, season by season. If you are drifting towards sleep, let that idea soften. Great changes can come from small, repeated steps, taken without urgency. This knowledge also shaped cooperation between groups. When different groups followed similar herds, they shared information about routes and conditions. This exchange increased collective understanding. If your mind wanders, imagine that quiet sharing now. No formal meetings, just brief exchanges that improve everyone's chances. Understanding the land through herds reduced fear of the unknown. Familiar patterns replaced uncertainty. Even new places felt less threatening when their signs resembled known ones. If you feel calmer, that is natural. Familiarity soothes the nervous system, and this story is built on growing familiarity. The lessons learned were practical, but they also shaped human thought. People became more patient, more observant, and more adaptable. These traits were not taught through instruction. They emerged from necessity. If you are still awake, notice how these traits feel in the telling. They encourage slow breathing and relaxed attention. Following herds also taught restraint. Taking too much, moving too fast, or acting impulsively often led to trouble. Restraint preserved resources and strength. If you are feeling restless, let restraint soften that restlessness. The story values moderation, and moderation brings ease. As knowledge accumulated, confidence grew, but it remained quiet. People did not boast about understanding the land. They simply used it. This quiet confidence reduced anxiety. If you are sleepy, let that confidence cradle you. No need to prove anything. No need to rush. Not all knowledge was retained forever. Routes changed. Herds shifted. Climate varied. People adapted again. Learning was continuous. If your mind seeks final answers, you can let that need rest. The story does not offer final knowledge. It offers ongoing learning. Now, as this segment gently draws to a close, the image remains open. People walk across frozen land carrying not only tools and supplies, but accumulated understanding. This understanding guides them without shouting, like a quiet companion. You can let that companion walk beside you now, steady and calm, as your thoughts slow and rest becomes easier, without any need for a strong conclusion. In the 10th and final part of our story, everything gently widens. The small, careful decisions made each day by early humans did more than keep them alive for another night. Over very long stretches of time, those decisions slowly carried people across vast distances, not through sudden ambition and not through planned conquest, but through patient following. A herd moved. People followed. Seasons changed. Paths extended. And step by step, frozen lands became familiar ground, as long as Allah allowed those journeys to unfold. No one set out with the idea of changing history. Each movement was practical and immediate. Food was needed. Warmth was needed. Safety was needed. Yet when these needs were met repeatedly by following herds, humans gradually found themselves far from where their ancestors once stood. The world expanded quietly. If your thoughts feel heavy, you can let them rest here. This story reminds us that large changes do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive softly, disguised as routine. Frozen plains, river valleys, and ice-edged routes slowly linked regions together. Knowledge traveled with people, not in written form, but in memory. A safe crossing, a dangerous slope, a reliable shelter. These details passed from one generation to the next, carried by voices and example. If you are drifting towards sleep, imagine those memories traveling gently, like embers passed carefully from one fire to another, never claimed as permanent, but useful while they last. Over time, humans learned that survival did not require domination of the land. It required cooperation with its patterns. The herds moved according to food and season. The land shaped movement through ice, wind, and terrain. Humans adapted to both. This adaptability became one of humanity's quiet strengths. If you feel calm now, that calm echoes the understanding that control is limited, but responsiveness can be enough. The story offers that idea without insisting on it. As people spread into new areas, they encountered unfamiliar conditions, different snow textures, different winds, different animals. Yet the core skills remained useful. Observation, patience, restraint. These qualities traveled well. If your mind wanders, return to that simplicity. Skills grounded in attention tend to remain valuable, even when surroundings change. The frozen lands themselves were never gentle, but they were consistent in their demands. They rewarded careful preparation. They punished haste. Over generations, people learned to respect these demands. Respect here did not mean fear or worship. It meant understanding limits and working within them. If you are listening while tired, let that respect feel restful. There is peace in accepting what cannot be forced. Herds continued to shape routes long after the first humans followed them. Even as climate shifted, the idea of moving with resources rather than against them remained. This principle guided later movements into new territories. If you imagine these journeys now, let them feel slow and quiet, not dramatic. The story is not about triumph. It is about endurance. What may seem ordinary in the telling was extraordinary in effect. Walking, watching, waiting, repeating. These actions carried people across landscapes that might otherwise have remained unreachable. If your thoughts drift, let them settle on that repetition. Repetition is often what allows change to happen gently, without strain. The people in this story did not leave monuments behind. Ice and wind would erase them anyway. What remained was knowledge carried forward. Knowledge of how to dress, how to pace, how to wait, how to follow without losing oneself. If you feel you're breathing slow, that knowledge is doing its work even now, encouraging steadiness. As herds crossed bridges of ice that later melted away, humans crossed too, unaware that those crossings would never exist again in the same way. Yet nothing here is described as lasting forever. Routes change, ice melts, lands shift. Only Allah is everlasting. Human movement remains temporary, shaped by conditions of the moment. Looking back from far in the future, it might be tempting to frame these journeys as bold exploration. But from within the story, they felt ordinary. Each day was simply another day of walking, resting, and deciding. That ordinariness is important. It reminds us that history is often made quietly, without anyone noticing. The frozen world taught humans humility. It taught that strength has limits, and that listening often matters more than acting. These lessons were learned slowly, sometimes painfully, but they endured because they worked. If you are awake, let that humility soften your thoughts. If you are sleepy, let it carry you downward into rest. Even now, traces of those ancient movements remain in the way humans understand distance, seasons, and cooperation. The habits formed in cold lands did not disappear when climates changed. They adapted. If you let your attention wander, imagine that continuity stretching gently across time, linking past and present without effort. The story does not end with a final destination. There is no single place where following stopped. People continued to move as long as movement made sense. And when movement stopped, rest followed. This balance is what sustained them. If you are listening in bed, that balance may feel especially close now. You may notice that nothing in this story demanded belief in forces beyond observation and effort. There were no promises, no guarantees, only careful choices made within the world Allah created. That grounding keeps the story calm and steady, suitable for rest. As the night deepens, you can allow the images to soften. The herd fades into distance. The footsteps become quieter. The cold remains outside the shelter. Inside, there is warmth, patience, and stillness. If your thoughts return briefly, that is fine. You can gently guide them back to the simplest image. A long horizon, slow movement, a quiet decision made without rush. Now, as this final segment comes to rest, there is no strong resolution. The journey continues somewhere beyond this moment, just as sleep continues beyond wakefulness. And that is enough. Thank you for spending this time listening to a quiet story from deep history. Thank you for allowing these slow moments to unfold. May your rest be gentle, your breathing steady, and your night peaceful.